Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was chosen by Anubis as the judge of heroes and villains? Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The wind on the rooftop was a liar. It whipped around Izuku Midoriya with a frantic energy, tugging at his uniform and whispering of flight, of freedom, of possibilities. But Izuku knew the truth. There was no flight for him. No freedom. And the world, in the form of his generation's greatest hero, had just methodically, surgically, and with a sad, pitying kindness, extinguished every last one of his possibilities. It's not bad to dream. But you have to be realistic. All Might's words weren't an echo in his ears. They were a brand on his soul. The steam had faded, the skeletal man had departed, and Izuku was left alone with the gaping, hollow chasm where his dreams used to be. For 14 years, that space had been filled to bursting with vibrant color, with sketches of costumes, with scribbled analyses of quirks, with the booming, triumphant laughter of his idol. Now, it was a silent, gray void. He didn't remember walking down the stairs. He didn't remember leaving the building. The bustling city of Muzurifu, usually a symphony of life and potential heroics that he meticulously observed, was now just noise. A cacophony of meaningless sound that washed over him without purchase. His feet, acting on some deep, forgotten instinct, carried him forward, but his mind was adrift in the new, terrifying emptiness. He passed the Takoba Municipal Beach Park, the shoreline choked with discarded appliances and mountains of trash. He'd always seen it as a future training ground, a place where he could build his body to compensate for his lack of a quirk. Now, it just looked like a graveyard of broken things. Just like him. His bag, heavy with his hero analysis notebooks, felt like a tombstone strapped to his back. Hero Analysis for the Future, number 13. The title was a cruel joke. He clutched the straps, the worn fabric a familiar comfort that now felt alien. Each page was a testament to a lifetime of wasted effort, a prayer sent to a god who had just told him he wasn't listening. A distant explosion rattled the windows of a nearby storefront. A plume of black smoke coiled into the sky a few blocks away. The old Izuku would have been sprinting towards it, notebook already in hand, his mind alight with frantic calculations and observations. The new Izuku, the hollow one, barely turned his head. It was just more noise. Another hero would handle it. That was their job. It would never be his. He saw the crowd first, a knot of panicked civilians and curious onlookers craning their necks. He heard the familiar cackle and saw the viscous, green form of the sludge villain he'd inadvertently freed earlier. And there, in its suffocating grasp, was a thrashing figure with explosive sparks bursting from his palms. Kaken. Bakugo Katsuki was suffocating. He was going to die. Izuku's feet were rooted to the pavement. He watched as the pro-heroes on the scene, Kamui Woods, Death Arms, Empty Lady, stood by, unable to act effectively. He saw the desperation in Kaken's eyes, a primal terror that stripped away all his usual arrogance. And Izuku felt nothing. It was the most terrifying sensation of his life. Not a flicker of adrenaline. Not the instinctive urge to run forward, to throw his backpack, to do something. There was just a profound, soul-deep weariness. A detached, clinical observation that a boy who had tormented him his entire life was now in mortal danger. And it simply did not matter. The gears of the world would keep turning. Heroes would save people, villains would be defeated. And Izuku Midoriya would remain on the sidelines. The void inside him had swallowed his empathy whole. He turned away from the scene, the explosions and shouts fading behind him. He didn't see All Might arrive. He didn't see the triumphant resolution. He just walked. He let the city's labyrinthine streets guide him. His path as aimless as his future. He walked until the sun began to dip below the towering skyscrapers, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that he couldn't bring himself to appreciate. His wandering eventually led him to a part of the city he rarely visited. The buildings here were older, made of stone and brick rather than chrome and polymer. The noise of the downtown core was muted, replaced by a respectful quiet. He found himself standing before the grand, neoclassical facade of the Muzurifu Municipal Museum of World History. He didn't know why he was here. Perhaps because it was a place for things that were no longer relevant. The entrance fee was negligible. The cavernous main hall was nearly empty, his soft footsteps echoing on the polished marble floors. He drifted past exhibits of ancient Greece, their marble gods and goddesses frozen in poses of power and grace he could no longer aspire to. He bypassed the Roman section, with its busts of stern-faced emperors who had commanded the world. It was all just history. Dead and gone. He was drawn deeper into the museum, to a wing that was even quieter than the rest. The lighting was dim, the air still and dry, carrying the faint, sweet scent of aged linen and dust. The sign above the archway read, "The Nile's Legacy, Treasures of Ancient Egypt." He walked among glass cases holding pottery, intricate jewelry, and scrolls of papyrus covered in delicate, bird-like hieroglyphs. He stared at massive stone sarcophagi, their surfaces carved with stoic faces and warnings to would-be tomb robbers. There was a sense of immense time in this room, of millennia compressed into a single, silent space. It was humbling, and for the first time since that rooftop, the crushing weight of his own insignificant despair lessened, dwarfed by the sheer scale of the history around him. At the very center of the exhibit, set on a low, black pedestal, was a life-sized statue. It was carved from dark basalt, smooth and cool to the eye. It depicted a tall, slender humanoid figure with the regal, alert head of a jackal. One hand held a long staff, the other an ankh, the symbol of life. A small, bronze plaque on the pedestal read, Anubis, ancient Egyptian god of embalming, funerals, and the afterlife. The weigher of the heart, and the final judge of the dead. Izuku stared at the statue, captivated. There was no menace in the carving, no malice in its obsidian-inlaid eyes. There was only a profound stillness, a sense of duty, of patience, of an ancient, unyielding purpose. The final judge. The one who determined if a soul was worthy. Not based on power, or fame, or the quirk they were born with, but on the weight of their heart. He reached out, his fingers hovering just an inch from the cold stone of the statue's leg. He thought of his own heart. What would it weigh? It felt so heavy right now, burdened by failure and a terrifying new emptiness. But was it a bad heart? He'd always tried to do the right thing, to help people. It was the one thing he thought he was good at. As his mind swirled with these thoughts, something in the room shifted. It wasn't a sound. It was the absence of it. The low hum of the climate control ceased. The distant shuffle of another patron's feet vanished. The very air in the room grew thick and heavy, pressing in on him like the deep ocean. The soft, artificial lights of the exhibit flickered once, twice, and then seemed to dim, drawing all remaining illumination towards the statue at the center. The shadows around the basalt figure deepened, coalescing. They flowed like ink, clinging to the statue's form, and the air grew cold, smelling of desert nights and forgotten tombs. Izuku's breath hitched, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't a quirk. It felt older. Primal. The obsidian eyes of the statue glowed with a soft, silver light. The basalt form seemed to ripple, the stone transmuting into something that was both shadow and substance. The figure on the pedestal straightened, stepping down onto the marble floor with a soundless grace that defied its stone origins. It was no longer a statue. It was a being, standing over 7 feet tall. The head was that of a sleek, black jackal, its ears perked and attentive. The body was that of a perfectly formed man, wrapped in a simple linen kilt, his skin the color of twilight. The silver light in its eyes was not threatening, it was ancient, and possibly wise, and filled with a melancholy that resonated with the void in Izuku's own chest. The ankh and staff it held were no longer stone, but seemed to be forged from moonlight. Izuku was frozen, not by fear, but by an overwhelming, all-encompassing awe. Then, the being spoke. Its voice was not something that entered his ears, but something that bloomed directly in his mind. It was the rustle of dried papyrus, the whisper of sand across the tomb floor, the final, contented sigh of a soul at peace. I have heard the shattering of your heart, Izuku Midoriya. Izuku couldn't speak. He could only stare, his mind reeling. How did it know his name? I have watched you for some time. I have seen your meticulous chronicling of this world's new pantheon. I have felt your desperate yearning for justice, and I have tasted the bitter ashes of your hope, scattered by the words of the one you called a god. The being, Anubis, took another silent step forward. The silver light of its eyes seemed to peer right through Izuku, past his skin and bone, and into the very core of his being. What are you? Izuku finally stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. I am as the plaque described. I am the arbiter, the guardian of the scales. And I am concerned. Anubis gestured with a slender hand towards the world outside the museum walls. This era you live in is one of great imbalance. These abilities you call quirks are like fragments of divinity, scattered randomly among mortals. They have created a new, chaotic pantheon of heroes and villains, gods and demons of temporary myth. They fight their spectacular battles, and humanity applauds their power. But in their noise and their fury, the concept of Ma'at, of cosmic order, of truth, of fundamental justice, has been eroded. The god's gaze returned to Izuku. The heroes of this age are not judged by the purity of their intentions, but by their popularity rankings and the effectiveness of their power. The villains are not judged by the nature of their suffering, but by the scale of their destruction. It is a system of power, not of justice. The scales are broken. Izuku listened, his mind, once numb, now racing to comprehend. Everything the god said rang with a terrifying, undeniable truth. He'd seen it himself. The grandstanding, the merchandise, the focus on public image. He'd seen villains who were just desperate people pushed to the edge. He'd meticulously documented the system, but he had never dared to question its very foundation. Why are you telling me this? Izuku asked, his voice trembling. Because the scales require a hand to steady them. A mortal champion. An arbiter who can walk among your kind and weigh their hearts not with prejudice or law, but with absolute clarity. I have searched for such a vessel for a long time. Anubis was now standing directly before him. Izuku had to crane his neck to look into those ancient, silver eyes. I have observed those with great power. But their quirks taint their perspective. They see the world through the lens of their own strength. I have observed those with great intelligence, but their ambition curdles their judgment. I needed one who stood apart from it all, one whose heart was not weighted by a quirk, but was instead filled with an obsessive, unwavering desire to understand and to see fairness done. The realization hit Izuku with the force of a physical blow. Me? But I'm quirkless. I'm a Deku. I'm useless. The words came out, a reflexive recitation of a lifetime of mockery. The god's jackal head tilted slightly, an expression of something akin to pity in its ancient eyes. That is what the broken world has told you. I am telling you the truth. Anubis raised a hand, and an image shimmered in the air between them. It was a set of golden, ethereal scales. Your lack of a quirk is not a deficiency, it is a purity. You stand outside the system you must judge, untainted by its power. Your obsessive analysis is not a pointless hobby, it is the precision of a scholar of souls. Your empathy, which causes you so much pain, is not a weakness, it is the tool by which you can understand both the hero and the villain. You, Izuku Midoriya, were not born to be a player in their game, you were born to be the judge. The air crackled with power. The offer hung there, immense and terrifying. I cannot give you a quirk. What I offer is not a power to be wielded for fame or glory. It is an authority. A burden. I will open your eyes to the truth of the souls around you. I will give you the authority of the scales, the power to perceive the weight of a heart, and to enact a judgment that restores its balance. Izuku's mind was a whirlwind. This was insane. It had to be a dream, a grief-induced hallucination. But the cold air on his skin, the palpable presence of the god before him, the resonating truth of his words, it all felt more real than anything he had experienced all day. He thought of All Might's back as he walked away. He thought of Kaken's sneer. He thought of a world that had looked at him, and found him wanting, had weighed him and found him to be nothing. And here was a god. A literal god of judgment, telling him that his nothingness was his greatest strength. That his entire life had not been a pathetic failure, but an unconscious preparation for a role he couldn't have imagined. The emptiness inside him was still there. But now, it felt less like a void and more like a vessel, waiting to be filled. This offer, it wasn't the bright, smiling dream he had chased his whole life. It was something darker, heavier, and lonelier. But it was a purpose. It was a reason to exist. What What would I have to do? He whispered. You will see the truth. And you will act upon it. You will weigh the hearts of the lauded hero and the despised criminal. You will perceive the greed corrupting a savior's soul, and the desperation that birthed a monster. Your judgments will not be of fists and fury, but of conscience and consequence. You will be a whisper of justice in a world that only screams of power. It will be a thankless, solitary path. You will be understood by no one, a solitary path. He was already on one. Tears welled in Izuku's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of a desperate, terrifying release. The hope that had been so brutally murdered on that rooftop was being resurrected, but as something new. Something strange and severe. He looked at the god, at the weigher of hearts, and straightened his back. The boy who had been told he couldn't be a hero was about to become something more. I accept. The words were quiet, but they sealed the pact with the weight of an oath sworn before time itself. Anubis nodded, a slow, solemn gesture. So be it. The pact is made. He raised the ankh he held. It glowed with a brilliant, white light that did not hurt to look at. He touched the head of the symbol to the back of Izuku's right hand. The sensation was not of heat or cold, but of pure meaning. It was an influx of information, of concepts beyond human language, balance, consequence, mortality, eternity. Izuku felt a profound connection to something ancient and vast. A single, perfect ankh, the color of a fading shadow, burned itself into his skin. It didn't hurt. It simply was. When the light faded, the mark was gone from sight, but Izuku could feel it there, a cool spot on his skin, a new weight tethered to his soul. The authority is yours, Anubis's voice resonated in his mind, already sounding more distant. Learn its nature. Trust your instincts. You are no longer just Izuku Midoriya. You are my judge. You are the hand that holds the scales. The shadows in the room began to recede. The thick, ancient presence of the god thinned, becoming translucent. The air warmed, and the low hum of the building's systems returned with a soft drone. The being that was Anubis seemed to dissolve back into the basalt statue, the silver light in its eyes fading until only the polished obsidian remained. Izuku stood alone in the center of the Egyptian exhibit, his heart pounding a frantic, wild rhythm. His body trembled with the aftershocks of the encounter. He slowly, hesitantly, raised his right hand. To his eyes, the skin was unblemished. But he could feel it. The ankh. The pact. The purpose. He stumbled out of the museum, back into the twilight of the city. The noise was no longer meaningless. Each car horn, each snippet of conversation, each distant siren seemed to carry a new resonance. He felt connected to it all in a way he never had before. He was still Izuku Midoriya. Still small. Still, to the rest of the world, quirkless. But the emptiness inside him was no longer a void. It now held an echo of an ancient promise, of a divine purpose, and the silent, ever-present weight of the scales of justice. His path forward was no longer erased. A new one, shrouded in shadow and uncertainty, stretched out before him. And for the first time, he would walk it alone. Izuku woke to the gentle, familiar scent of frying fish and miso soup. For a blissful, disoriented moment, everything was normal. The sun streamed through his all-might-themed curtains, casting a golden, heroic glow on the posters that papered his walls. The world was solid, the ache in his muscles was from a restless sleep, and the events of the previous evening felt like the feverish, overwrought fabric of a dream, a hallucination born from the deepest well of his despair. He sat up, his head throbbing with a dull ache, like the aftermath of a migraine. He ran a hand through his unruly green hair. A god? Anubis? The judge of? It sounded ridiculous in the morning light. A coping mechanism, his subconscious mind spinning a fantasy grand enough to plaster over the gaping wound All Might had left. He had simply wandered into a museum and let his imagination run wild. That had to be it. He swung his legs out of bed, his feet hitting the cold wood floor. As he stood, a wave of vertigo washed over him, so intense he had to grip his desk to keep from falling. The room tilted, and for a split second, the air seemed to shimmer, as if he were looking through a heat haze. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. Izuku? Breakfast is ready, sweetie. His mother's voice called from the kitchen. Coming! He called back, his voice hoarse. He took a deep breath, the dizziness receding. It was just exhaustion. Emotional and physical. He'd walk it off. He glanced at his right hand, half expecting to see the phantom brand. Nothing. Just pale skin and a few old scars from childhood mishaps. A wave of something cold and hollow washed over him, disappointment. The absurdity of it struck him. He was disappointed that his insane dream of being chosen by an ancient Egyptian death god wasn't real. That's how far he'd fallen. He pulled on his school uniform, the black fabric feeling like a shroud. Another day of mockery, of pitying looks, of being the useless Deku in a world of wonders. He picked up his backpack, the weight of his notebooks a familiar burden. Everything was exactly as it was before. Nothing had changed. He walked into the small dining area, where his mother, Inko Midoriya, was placing a bowl of rice on the table. She turned to him with her usual warm, slightly worried smile. Good morning, Izuku. Did you sleep well? You were out so late. I slept okay, he mumbled, sliding into his chair. I saw the news last night, she said, her voice dropping. That sludge villain, and Katsuki-kun. It was so frightening. I'm glad you weren't anywhere near there. Izuku just nodded, picking up his chopsticks. He didn't have the heart to tell her that he had been there. That he had been responsible for the villain's escape. That he had stood there and watched his childhood friends suffocate and felt absolutely nothing. The guilt, which had been absent during his hollowed-out wandering, now returned with a vengeance, a cold stone in his stomach. As he looked at his mother, at her kind face etched with concern for him, the world tilted again. This time it was different. It wasn't just dizziness. A silver, ethereal light bloomed in his vision, overlaying the mundane reality of their kitchen. He blinked, but it didn't go away. The light coalesced, taking on a definite, impossible shape. Superimposed over his mother, like a ghostly double exposure, was a magnificent set of scales. They were forged from what looked like solidified moonlight, impossibly intricate and perfectly balanced. They hovered in the air behind her, the central beam aligned with her spine, the two large pans level with her shoulders. Izuku stared, his chopsticks frozen halfway to his mouth. This wasn't a dream, this was real. This was the power Anubis had promised. The authority of the scales. He could see her soul, and on the scales there were weights. On one pan, the side representing her virtues and good deeds, were countless motes of warm, glowing light. They pulsed with a gentle rhythm, like fireflies. As he focused, he could somehow understand what they were. A lifetime of unconditional love for her son. The quiet sacrifices of a single parent. Thousands of small kindnesses offered to neighbors and strangers. The unwavering belief in him, even when he couldn't believe in himself. It was a staggering, beautiful weight. On the other pan, the side of her sins and burdens, were a few small, dark pebbles. They weren't black with malice, but a sorrowful gray. He understood them, too, the crushing guilt she felt over his quirklessness, a burden she had irrationally taken upon herself. A deep-seated fear for his safety. The quiet, hidden tears she shed when she thought he wasn't looking. These were not sins, they were the heavy weights of love and worry. The scales were almost perfectly balanced, tipping ever so slightly towards the side of light. Her heart was true. It was pure. Tears welled in Izuku's eyes. He had always known he loved his mother, but seeing her soul laid bare like this, it was an intimacy so profound it stole his breath. He saw the sheer, unblemished goodness of the woman who had raised him, and he was humbled to his very core. Izuku? Is everything okay? You're crying. Inko's voice was laced with alarm. She reached across the table, her hand on his forehead. You don't feel warm. Are you sick? Izuku quickly wiped his eyes, the vision of the scales fading as his focus broke. And no, Mom, I'm fine. Really. I just realized how much I appreciate you, that's all. Inko's worried expression melted into a watery, confused smile. Oh, Izuku, you're such a sweet boy. He finished his breakfast in a daze, the taste of the food lost on him. The world had fundamentally, irrevocably changed. He wasn't just looking at people anymore. He was seeing the very essence of who they were. The power was passive, it seemed. A low hum in the back of his mind that flared into full vision when he focused his attention. As he walked to school, he tried it again. A quick, darting glance at a salaryman rushing for a train. Scales appeared. The virtue pan held a respectable weight, diligence, love for his family. The sin pan was heavier, weighed down by polished stones of ambition that led him to step on his colleagues, a secret, ugly nugget of envy for his boss, and the leaden weight of infidelity. Izuku looked away, his stomach churning. It was too much. It was like reading a stranger's diary, their deepest, darkest secrets exposed to him without their consent. He felt like a voyeur of the soul. Anubis had called this a burden, and now, Izuku was beginning to understand why. The school day was a unique form of torture. He tried to keep his head down, to not focus on anyone, but it was impossible. Every time his eyes lingered on a classmate or a teacher, the silver scales would shimmer into existence. He saw the lazy apathy of some, the desperate insecurity of others. He saw the small, bright lights of friendship and the heavy, ugly stones of jealousy and spite. When Bakugo Katsuki swaggered into the classroom, surrounded by his usual sycophants, Izuku instinctively focused on him. Kaken's scales were a tumultuous, violent storm. The virtue side was not empty, as Izuku might have once suspected. It held one enormous, blazing weight of pure, unadulterated conviction, a diamond-hard belief in victory, an unwavering drive to be the number one hero. It was a power so immense it was almost blinding. But it was alone. The other side was a chaotic mess. Jagged shards of obsidian representing his explosive pride. Heavy, dense chunks of iron that were his contempt for the weak. And nestled amongst them were dozens of small, sharp stones of cruelty, each one a memory of a burn, a taunt, a sneer directed at Izuku. And underneath it all, a single, pulsing, terrified weight that Izuku couldn't quite decipher, a deep, hidden fear of being surpassed, of not being the best. His soul was a raging bonfire of ambition built on a foundation of profound insecurity. Izuku quickly looked down at his desk, his heart pounding. To know this about Kaken, it didn't make him feel better. It didn't make the years of bullying go away. It just made them sadder, more pathetic. He barely heard a word the teachers said all day. His mind was consumed by the implications of his new sight. He could see the truth. The raw, unfiltered, often ugly truth of everyone. What was he supposed to do with it? That evening, he was in his room, trying to force himself to do his homework. He had the television on for background noise, the national news droning on about economic forecasts and political squabbles. He wasn't paying attention until the anchor's tone shifted. And in business news, the data tech firm Cyber Solutions was saved from a major corporate espionage attack today by the rising star hero, Captain Celebrity. Izuku looked up. On the screen was live footage from earlier in the day. A man in a ridiculously flashy silver and gold costume was waving to a crowd of cheering reporters and fans. He had a chiseled jaw, perfect teeth, and a quirk that seemed to involve manipulating light into hard constructs, which he used to form a cage around a nervous-looking man in a cheap suit. The villain, who goes by the name Override, the anchor continued, attempted to steal proprietary data worth billions. But he was no match for Captain Celebrity, whose dazzling limelight barrier trapped the culprit with zero damage to the surrounding property. The old Izuku would have been scrambling for his notebook, frantically sketching Captain Celebrity's costume, analyzing the potential applications and weaknesses of his quirk. The new Izuku simply watched, a cold curiosity stirring within him. He narrowed his eyes and focused. He focused on the villain, Override. The man was cuffed, his head bowed in shame. His ethereal scales shimmered into view. The pan of sin was heavy, holding a single, large, multifaceted stone of grand larceny. But it was a murky, gray color, not the pitch black of malice. Izuku could feel the intent behind it. He saw flashes of understanding, a sick wife, mountains of medical bills, a foreclosure notice. The weight on the scale was not greed, it was pure, unadulterated desperation. Then, Izuku shifted his focus to the preening hero. The world seemed to lurch. Captain Celebrity's scales were the most horrifying thing Izuku had ever seen. The pan of virtue held a single, small, tarnished silver coin. It represented the act of stopping the crime, yes, but it was a pittance. An afterthought? The other side overflowed. It was a treasure chest of corruption. Gleaming gold bars of greed, pulsing with the kickbacks he received from corporations for prioritizing their security. Polished obsidian mirrors of narcissism, reflecting his obsession with his public image and ratings. There were heavy, leaden ingots of reckless endangerment from past fights he'd won, where he'd ignored collateral damage that was later covered up by his agency. And most damning of all, was a slick, oily weight of collusion. He had been tipped off about the robbery by a rival corporation, allowing him to show up at the perfect moment for maximum media exposure. This man wasn't a hero. He was a corporation in a cape. A symbol of everything Anubis had spoken of. A man lauded for his power, whose soul was a cesspool of corruption. The system didn't just allow him to exist, it actively rewarded him. The sight of it, the sheer injustice of it, made Izuku sick to his stomach. He stumbled to his bathroom and retched into the toilet, his body trembling. This was the world he had idolized. This was the profession he had worshipped. It was a lie. A beautifully packaged, commercially viable lie. He couldn't stay inside. The walls of his room, covered in the faces of smiling, false idols, were suffocating him. He needed air. He needed to walk. He pulled on a plain, dark green hoodie, pulling the hood up to shadow his face. He left a note for his mom saying he was going for a walk and slipped out into the cool night air. The city was alive with neon and noise, but to Izuku, it now felt like a masquerade ball, where everyone wore a pleasant mask and he was the only one who could see the monstrous faces beneath. He walked without a destination, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and righteous anger. What was he supposed to do? Expose Captain's celebrity? Who would believe him? A quirkless, nobody teenager. They would call him a liar, a delusional fandom. His power wasn't proof. It was just something he could see. His bitter thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp cry from a nearby alleyway. Please, just take the wallet. It's all I have. Izuku froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. Crime. A real crime, happening right now. He peered into the mouth of the narrow alley. Under the dim, orange glow of a security light, a scene straight out of a PSA was unfolding. A large, brutish man had a smaller, well-dressed man pinned against the brick wall. A knife glinted in the mugger's hand. The old Izuku would have been paralyzed by fear, or would have foolishly tried to run for help. The new Izuku felt a strange, cold calm descend upon him. This was a test. A real one. He focused, his new senses taking over. First, the mugger. His scales appeared, grim and heavy. The sin of the act was a jagged, ugly weight on one side. But the other side was piled high with the crushing weight of poverty. He could sense the gnawing hunger, the desperation of a lost job, the image of a small, coughing child in a cold apartment. The man wasn't a monster. He was a cornered animal. Then Izuku looked at the victim, the man in the expensive-looking suit who was pleading for his life. His scales shimmered into view, and Izuku's breath caught in his throat. They were even worse than Captain's celebrities. The virtue side was almost empty, holding only dust. The sin side was a pit. It was weighed down with dozens of cold, sharp-edged stones of usury. There were weights made of the crystallized tears of families he had financially ruined with predatory loans. There was the heavy, suffocating weight of callous indifference to the suffering he caused. This victim was a predator of a different kind, a lone shark who bled people dry with a pen instead of a knife. In the grand cosmic balance of things, the man with the knife was the lesser of two evils. A voice, ancient and resonant, whispered in the back of his mind. It was the echo of Anubis. An imbalance. Balance must be restored. Izuku knew what he had to do. He didn't have a plan. He just had the authority. He stepped into the alley, his heart pounding not with fear, but with a terrifying sense of purpose. Hey! He called out. His voice cracked, but it was loud enough. Both men turned to look at him, startled. The mugger tightened his grip on the knife. Get lost, kid! This ain't your business. The lone shark's eyes widened with a flicker of hope. Help! Call the police! Izuku ignored them both. He focused all his will, all his attention on the mugger. He looked past the knife, past the snarling face, and directly at the shimmering, unbalanced scales of his soul. He didn't know how he knew the words, they just came to him, a whisper from his lips that was somehow imbued with divine power. "I see your desperation," he said, his voice low and steady. "But this is not the way." He enacted his first judgment. It wasn't a conscious command, but an instinctual push, a metaphysical nudge to the scales. He whispered an edict, a word of power that only the universe could hear. Penance. The mugger's body went rigid. The knife clattered to the grimy pavement. His eyes, which had been hard with aggression, suddenly widened with horror. A tidal wave of guilt, far more powerful than any he had ever felt, crashed over him. He saw his actions through his victim's eyes, felt the terror, the cold dread. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his head, great, shuddering sobs racking his body. "I'm sorry," he wept, the words torn from him. "Oh God, I'm so sorry. I can't." But Izuku's judgment was not just punishment. It was balance. Alongside the crushing guilt, a second, gentler wave washed over the man, hope. A sudden, inexplicable image flooded his mind, a help-wanted sign in a factory window he'd passed a dozen times without noticing. A memory of a friend who had offered him a loan weeks ago, a path forward clear and bright, where before there had only been a dead end. He looked up, his tear-streaked face a mask of confusion and dawning relief. Izuku then turned his attention to the loan shark, who was staring at the weeping mugger in stunned disbelief. The man straightened his suit, a smug, contemptuous look returning to his face. "What did you do to him? Some kind of mental quirk? Good riddance. Scum of the earth." Izuku's eyes hardened. He looked at the man's soul, at the pit of avarice and cruelty, and felt a cold, righteous fury. He passed his second judgment. Empathy. The loan shark scoffed, about to say something else, but the words died in his throat. He gasped, his eyes bulging. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly felt like it was hanging off a starving frame. He felt a phantom, gnawing hunger in his own belly. The cold of a winter night seeped into his bones, the kind you feel when your heat has been shut off. He felt the crushing despair of a foreclosure notice, the helpless terror of watching your child shiver with a fever you can't afford to treat. He was experiencing, all at once, the pain and suffering of every single person he had ever ruined. He screamed. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure agony. He stumbled back, clawing at his chest as if to rip the feelings out. He fell to the ground, curling into a fetal position, his mind fractured by the weight of 1,000 sorrows that were not his own, but that he had caused. The effort of wielding such a power, of channeling a divine authority, hit Izuku like a physical blow. The world swam before his eyes. A thin trickle of blood ran from his nose. He was dizzy, drained, his entire body humming like a struck tuning fork. He backed away slowly, leaving the two men in the alley, one weeping with guilt and newfound hope, the other screaming in the throes of a forced conscience. He had not laid a single finger on either of them, but he had dispensed a justice more profound and more terrible than any hero's punch. He stumbled home, his legs unsteady. When he got back to his room, he collapsed into his chair, his mind reeling. He looked at the pristine, white UA application form on his desk, the symbol of his lifelong dream. He thought of the smiling heroes, the cheering crowds, the flashy fights, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that it was the wrong path. His goal wasn't to be a symbol of peace, a shining beacon to be admired. His purpose was darker, quieter. He was to be a symbol of justice, a hidden force that corrected the balance. He pushed the UA form aside. He reached into his bag and pulled out a new, empty notebook. He uncapped his pen. On the cover, he didn't write hero analysis for the future. He paused, thinking, then wrote a new title, his handwriting firm and resolute. Ledger of Souls. Volume 1. He opened it to the first page. Under the heading, Case File 001, Captain Celebrity, he didn't sketch a costume or list a quirk. He drew a set of grotesquely unbalanced scales. And he began to list the weights. The rain fell in a fine, persistent mist, slicking the rooftops of Muzutafu with a mirror-like sheen that reflected the city's garish neon glow. On the edge of a 10-story office building, a figure crouched, perfectly still. He was a creature of the night, clad in muted, practical darkness. Black cargo pants, a reinforced dark green hoodie, and scuffed, silent-soled boots. But it was the mask that held the eye. Forged from a lightweight polymer, it was the stylized, angular face of a jackal, its long snout and perked ears giving the wearer an unnervingly inhuman silhouette. The eye sockets were fitted with dark, one-way lenses, betraying nothing of the boy beneath. 3 months had passed since Izuku Midoriya had accepted his pact in the silent halls of the museum. 3 months in which the timid, quirkless boy had been methodically erased, replaced by this new, purposeful entity. 3 months in which a new urban legend had begun to whisper its way through the city's dark alleys and corrupt boardrooms. They called him the Jackal. Below, in the rain-soaked loading bay of a warehouse, a deal was going down. Izuku didn't need to hear their words to understand the nature of the transaction. He had been tracking this group for a week. They were smugglers, dealing in black market tech, specifically stolen medical support items, life-saving equipment reverse-engineered and sold to wealthy villains and shady corporations, while the hospitals they were stolen from were left with shortages and heartbroken families. It was a profound imbalance. He watched as the leader of the smugglers, a burly man named Kento Tanaka, quirk, minor ferrokinesis, shook hands with the buyer. Izuku's gaze sharpened, and the world shimmered. The ethereal, silver scales of authority bloomed into existence behind Tanaka. His virtue pan was nearly empty, holding only a few dusty grains of misguided loyalty to his crew. His sin pan, however, was a mountain of jagged, ugly iron ore. The largest weight was a pulsating mass of pure avarice, but it was the smaller ones that sickened Izuku, dozens of tiny, tear-shaped stones, each one representing a life cut short, or made miserable by the lack of the equipment he trafficked. Izuku's new reality was a constant, aching empathy, weaponized by divine purpose. He could feel the phantom pain of a child's failing respiratory system, the despair of a family watching a loved one's vital signs fade. And he felt the cold indifference of the man responsible. He drew a breath, the cool, damp air filling his lungs. It was time to balance the scales. He moved, a whisper of motion. Using the network of pipes and fire escapes that crisscrossed the building faces, he descended, his movements fluid and precise. This was another part of his new life, grueling physical training. Hours spent at the now-cleared Dagoba beach, pushing his body to its absolute limit, followed by nights studying parkour and free-running videos, practicing until his muscles screamed and every inch of his body ached. He was no fighter, but he had become a phantom, an expert at navigating the city's verticality. He dropped into the loading bay behind a stack of crates, his landing making less sound than a falling raindrop. The deal was concluding. Money was changing hands. Pleasure doing business. Tanaka grunted, a greedy smile on his face. Izuku stepped out from the shadows. The 4 men froze, their heads snapping towards him. They saw the slender figure, the eerie, silent mask. "Who the hell are you?" one of the thugs growled, his knuckles cracking. "Hero wannabe?" Tanaka sneered. "Doesn't matter. Get him." "No witnesses," 2 of the men charged. Izuku didn't brace for a fight. He moved, using his smaller size and agility to his advantage. He sidestepped the first man's clumsy punch, ducking under his arm and weaving towards the leader. The second thug tried to grab him, but Izuku dropped low, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. He wasn't trying to injure them. He was just clearing a path. He came to a stop 10 feet from Tanaka, his dark lenses fixed on the man. Tanaka's confidence wavered for a split second, replaced by a primal flicker of unease. He reached out, and a length of rebar lying on the ground shuddered and flew into his hand. "You picked the wrong night to play dress-up, kid," he snarled. Izuku simply raised a hand, his fingers slightly curled. He focused on the mountain of sin weighing down Tanaka's soul. He opened his mouth, and a word, imbued with the authority of a god, slipped into the humid air. It was a whisper, but it hit Tanaka like a physical blow. Penance. Tanaka's body locked up. The rebar fell from his nerveless fingers, clanging on the concrete. His eyes, wide with shock, suddenly glazed over, looking at something that wasn't there. The smug sneer on his face contorted into a mask of abject horror. He was no longer in a loading bay in Muzudafu. He was in a sterile white hospital room, watching a monitor flatline. He was at a funeral, hearing the heartbroken sobs of a child who had lost her father. He was feeling the icy grip of pneumonia in his own lungs, the agony of a failing kidney, the terror of a weak heart giving out. He was experiencing the collected pain and grief of every single victim of his crimes, a tidal wave of suffering crashing directly into his soul. He screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure agony, and collapsed, clutching his head. He thrashed on the wet ground, not from any physical injury, but from a wound inflicted directly upon his conscience. The remaining thugs stared, utterly terrified. One of them, a young man who looked barely out of his teens, made a move to run. Izuku's head snapped towards him. He focused on the boy's scales. They were far less weighted, heavy with foolishness and the desperation to belong rather than true malice. He was a follower, a boy who justified his actions by telling himself he was just taking orders. Izuku passed a different judgment. Clarity. The young man froze mid-step. The self-serving justifications, the layers of delusion he had built up around himself, were instantly and brutally stripped away. He saw himself not as a tough guy in a gang, but as a pathetic, frightened child enabling the suffering of others for a pittance. He saw the disappointment in his mother's face, the dead-end path he was on, the utter, pathetic waste of his life. The illusion shattered, leaving only the cold, ugly truth. He crumpled to the ground, not screaming, but weeping with a quiet, soul-crushing shame. Izuku left them there for the authorities he had already tipped off with an anonymous call. He scaled the wall and melted back into the shadows of the rooftops, the rain washing the city clean. He was not a hero. Heroes captured. He was the judge. He balanced. Back in the sanctuary of his bedroom, the mask sat on his desk, its empty eyes seeming to watch him. The room was a strange dichotomy now. Half of it was still a shrine to All Might, a relic of a dead dream. The other half was the workshop of the jackal. On his desk, next to the mask, lay the Ledger of Souls, Volume 1. It was already a quarter full. Each entry was a meticulous profile. Not of quirks, but of souls. He drew the scales as he saw them, noting the size, shape, and nature of the weights on each side. He detailed the crimes, the motivations, and the judgments he had passed. Captain Celebrity's entry was the first and most detailed, a constant reminder of the systemic rot he was fighting. Creating the persona had been a logical, analytical process. The name, the Jackal, was an obvious choice, a direct homage to his patron. It was a name he had given himself, a way to separate the boy from the judge. The costume was born of necessity. He'd used the school's 3D printer late at night, accessing it through an anonymized student account, to create the mask from a design he'd spent weeks perfecting. It was intimidating, yes, but its primary purpose was to be a symbol, and to protect Izuku Midoriya. The rest of his gear was simple, chosen for mobility and stealth, bought with saved allowance money from a dozen different second-hand stores. His power, his authority, had required study. Through trial and error in those first few weeks, he had come to understand its nuances. It wasn't a quirk. It wasn't a biological function. It was a lens through which he saw the world, and a tool to interact with it on a fundamental level. He had named the applications himself, giving structure to the instincts Anubis had unlocked. Edict of Penance, forcing a soul to experience the consequences of their actions. His most powerful and draining tool for punishment. Edict of Clarity, stripping away delusion and self-justification. A tool for those who were lost, not truly evil. He knew there were others, nascent abilities stirring within the authority. He had felt a warmth, a light he hadn't yet figured out how to use. He was powerful, yes, but he was also vulnerable. He was still quirkless. Still physically weak compared to even a low-tier hero. If he was caught, if he was cornered, he had no super strength or energy blasts to save him. Only his wits, his agility, and his terrifying authority. He was a scalpel in a world of sledgehammers. In a stark, windowless interrogation room at the Mizurufu Police Prefecture, Detective Naomasa Tsukachi rubbed his temples, a deep sigh escaping his lips. Across the table from him sat the whimpering shell of Kento Tanaka. The man had been repeating the same things for an hour. I saw them. I saw all of them. The faces of He would devolve into sobs, unable to finish. Tsukachi's quirk, lie detector, was a simple, absolute thing. It told him if a person was speaking the truth, or a lie. And for the past 3 months, it had been giving him the biggest headache of his career. Tanaka believed every word he was saying. He truly believed he had been attacked by a ghost who had forced him to witness the deaths of his victims. Just like the corrupt politician who suddenly confessed to embezzlement, claiming a shadow with the face of a wolf made him see the faces of every citizen he'd stolen from. Just like the dozens of other criminals, from muggers to corporate spies, who had surrendered, confessed, and were now sitting in psych wards, babbling about a silent judge and a sudden, overwhelming guilt. The door opened and a tired-looking man in a black jumpsuit with a scarf-like capture weapon wrapped around his neck shuffled in. Shota Aizawa, the underground hero Eraserhead, looked as though he hadn't slept in a week, which was his default state. "Anything?" Aizawa asked, his voice a low monotone. "The same as the others," Tsukachi said, gesturing to the broken man. "He's telling the truth, or at least his version of it." Saw a figure in a jackal mask, and then his conscience apparently grew 3 sizes and crushed him from the inside out. Aizawa leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "I was at the scene." No sign of a struggle, other than one of the grunts who was clearly tripped. No energy residue, no sign of a quirk being used at all. "I tried using erasure on Tanaka when they brought him in. Nothing. If this is a quirk, it has no factor for me to cancel." That was the crux of the problem. No quirk factor meant it wasn't a quirk. But what else could it be? Mass hysteria? A new, undetectable psychoactive drug? Every theory had been a dead end. "The media has been calling him the conscience of Muzurifu," Tsukachi sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The online forums are calling him the Jackal Ghost. The Hero Public Safety Commission wants him designated a villain of the highest threat level. An unknown entity with a powerful mind-altering ability, operating outside of any legal framework? It's their worst nightmare." "He's not a killer," Aizawa mused, his sharp eyes focused on Tanaka. "He doesn't seem to be motivated by money or fame. His targets are specific. Corrupt politicians, violent criminals, polluters, exploiters. There's a pattern. It's a crusade. A crusade that is breaking dozens of laws," Tsukachi countered wearily. "He's a vigilante, Aizawa. And a uniquely dangerous one. We have to stop him." "How do you stop something that might not even be a person?" Aizawa retorted. "So far, all we have are terrified confessions and a single, recurring symbol, a jackal. For the case file, that's what we'll call him. The Jackal. I'll increase my patrols. If he's a physical entity, I'll find him. He's methodical, which means he's predictable." Aizawa's eyes narrowed. It was an illogical, irrational puzzle, and he hated those. But it was also a challenge. This jackal was a ghost in the system, and Shota Aizawa was the best ghost hunter they had. Not all of Izuku's nights were spent confronting the wicked. His power, he was learning, was about balance, and balance was not always about punishment. Sometimes, it was about reinforcement. One evening, while perched on a gargoyle overlooking a shopping district, his attention was drawn to a commotion below. A low-level villain with a minor strength-enhancing quirk was on a rampage, and raged after a botched robbery. He was swatting away police officers like flies. The hero on the scene was a rookie, a young woman in heavy, knight-like armor. Her hero name was Citadel. Her quirk, Bastion, allowed her to create localized force fields, but they were small and she could only manifest one at a time. She was clearly outmatched. The villain was too strong, too fast. He was battering her shields, and each impact made her stagger. Fear radiated from her in palpable waves. Izuku focused, and her scales shimmered into view. He gasped. They were the most beautiful things he had ever seen. The sin pan was utterly, completely empty. Not even a speck of dust. The virtue pan was overflowing with a solid, shining weight of pure, unadulterated altruism. A desire to protect the innocent so fierce, and so bright it was like looking into a miniature sun. She was a true hero, in every sense of the word. But she was terrified. Her fear was a phantom weight, pressing down on the virtue side, making the scales tremble. An imbalance. Not of morality, but of spirit. The villain roared and shattered her latest force field, sending her stumbling back towards a storefront window where a family was cowering. Her eyes were wide with panic. She was going to fail. Izuku felt the warm, gentle side of his authority stir within him. This was the moment. This was what it was for. He focused on the brilliant, shining weight of her soul and push, not with the cold finality of a judgment, but with the gentle encouragement of a whisper. Fortitude. Down below, Citadel braced for the final blow. Her arms trembled, her energy was depleted, her will was cracking. Then, something shifted. It was as if a cool, calming wave had washed over her. The frantic, screaming panic in her mind fell silent. The terror vanished, replaced by an ironclad certainty. Her fear was gone, burned away by the sudden, blazing intensity of her own heroic spirit, now unbound. She saw everything with perfect clarity. The villain's timing, the angle of his attack, the placement of the terrified civilians. She saw her path to victory. The villain lunged. At the last possible second, she didn't create a shield in front of her. She manifested one at his feet, angled like a ramp. The villain, caught off guard, tripped, his momentum carrying him up and over her head. At the same time, she brought a second shield into existence behind him, a vertical wall. He crashed into it with all his forward momentum, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Before he could recover, she trapped his limbs against the wall with 4 more perfectly placed, perfectly timed shields. He was pinned, helpless. The crowd erupted in cheers. The police officers stared, stunned at the rookie's sudden, masterful display. Citadel herself looked at her handiwork, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know how she'd done it. A moment ago, she had been paralyzed by fear. Now she just felt strong. She felt like the hero she had always dreamed of being. She scanned the rooftops, a strange feeling washing over her, as if she was being watched by some unseen, benevolent guardian. But there was no one there. From the shadows of a distant rooftop, the jackal watched her, a rare, small smile gracing Izuku's lips beneath the mask. He had not fought her battle for her. He had simply reminded her that she was strong enough to win it herself. He felt drained, but it was a different kind of exhaustion. A clean, satisfying weariness, not the soul-deep ache that came from judging the corrupt. He was not just an executioner of conscience. He could also be a guardian of virtue. His work for the night was done. He turned to leave, his police scanner murmuring in his ear. All units in the vicinity of the Kamino ward be aware. Eraserhead is active in the area, specifically canvassing for information on the vigilante case known as the Jackal. Izuku froze. Eraserhead. One of the few heroes he truly respected. A logical, relentless, underground professional who didn't care for the media circus. His quirk wouldn't work, but that didn't matter. Aizawa was a master of stealth, capture, and hand-to-hand combat. He was a genuine threat. The net was tightening. The city was aware of him now. He was no longer just a rumor. He was a case file. A target. He pulled the jackal mask down, ensuring it was secure. He looked out over the sprawling, electric-veined metropolis. It was a city of millions of souls, millions of tiny, flickering scales weighing truth and lies, virtue and sin. It was a city drowning in imbalance. Let them hunt him. Let them fear him. Let them misunderstand him. He had a purpose given to him by God. He was the weight that brought the scales back to center. He was the jackal of Muzutsu. And his judgment had only just begun. The world, for Izuku Midoriya, had become a tapestry of whispers and data streams. His bedroom, once a shrine to a singular hero, was now the nerve center of a one-man intelligence agency. The posters of All Might still smiled down, but they were now juxtaposed with a bank of 3 second-hand monitors, their glow casting a pale, determined light on his face. One screen scrolled with police and emergency service scanner feeds, which he was slowly learning to decipher. Another was a mosaic of obscure online forums and darknet message boards, places where villains and their informants boasted, traded information, and inadvertently revealed their plans. The third was for his own work, cross-referencing, data mining, and mapping the city's spiritual imbalances. It was on a Tuesday morning, while his former classmates would have been sitting in English class, that the whispers aligned into a scream. It started with a low-level chatter on a villain forum about a big recruitment drive. Then came a sudden, coordinated communications jam affecting a remote, uninhabited sector of the city, a minor detail, easily dismissed as a technical glitch. But Izuku's analysis, his obsessive need to connect the dots, flagged it. He cross-referenced the jam with UA's publicly available curriculum. The sector was adjacent to the unforeseen simulation joint, the USJ. He then checked the faculty schedule he'd painstakingly compiled from news articles and fan sites. All Might was scheduled to co-teach a rescue class there today. With Class 1A, a recruitment drive. A targeted communications jam. All Might's location. It was a planned attack. A major one. The scales in Izuku's mind, the metaphysical sense of balance that was now as much a part of him as his own heartbeat, began to vibrate violently. This wasn't a mugging or a corrupt politician. This was a declaration of war. A massive, bloody weight was about to be dropped onto the scales of society, and the potential for chaos, for death, for profound injustice, was immense. This was the kind of event his pact with Anubis was forged to confront. He didn't hesitate. He was already moving, stripping off his civilian clothes. The dark green hoodie, the cargo pants, the combat boots. He strapped a thin utility belt around his waist, containing a few smoke pellets, a grappling line, and a first aid kit. Practical tools for a quirkless body. Finally, he lifted the jackal mask from its stand. As he slid it over his face, the world sharpened, the boy named Izuku receding, and the cold, analytical purpose of the judge taking hold. The journey to the USJ was a blur of motion. He pushed his rigorously trained body to its limits, a phantom flowing across the rooftops of Muzurifu. He moved with a desperate urgency, the city a concrete parkour course under his feet. He was racing against the lives of 20 students, 3 pro-heroes, and the very stability of the symbol of peace. He wasn't going there to be a hero. He was going there because an act of such monumental evil could not go unanswered by the scales. He arrived at the crest of a hill overlooking the massive, domed structure of the USJ just as the first screams echoed from within. Through the glass, he could see the impossible scene, a swirling vortex of dark mist, dozens of villains pouring into the central plaza, and a lone, tired figure fighting desperately against them. Eraserhead. Izuku found a maintenance hatch on the roof, prying it open with a small crowbar from his belt. He slipped inside, his soft-soled boots making no sound on the metal catwalks high above the chaos. The sheer scale of the imbalance was a physical force, a nauseating pressure, in his mind. Below him, the students of Class 1A were scattered, teleported by the villain with the warped quirk. Shota Aizawa was a whirlwind of black cloth and fury, but he was outnumbered 100 to 1. And at the center of it all, standing by the fountain, were the 2 primary weights. A man whose body was covered in severed hands, scratching his neck with a manic energy, and a hulking, bird-like creature of pure, unadulterated menace. Izuku's objective was clear: neutralize the pawns, destabilize the board, and confront the king. He dropped from the catwalks into the shipwreck zone, landing silently in the water behind the boat. Inside, Tsuyu Ajui and Minoru Mineta were terrified, surrounded by villains with aquatic quirks. "Let's skin this frog girl first," one of them snarled, his shark-like features contorting. Before they could move, a voice, calm and unnervingly quiet, cut through the air from the boat's railing above them. "Your hearts are weighed." The villains spun around. They saw the jackal, a dark specter against the artificial sky. He looked at the shark man, at the soul so weighted by sadistic cruelty, and passed judgment. Penance. The villain screamed, his body seizing. He was no longer in the water. He was feeling the phantom sensation of his own skin being flayed, the memory of every wound he had ever inflicted on others replaying on his own nerve endings. He thrashed in the water, incapacitated by agony only he could feel. Izuku turned his gaze to the others, their souls heavy with greed and a follower's mentality. Clarity. The effect was instantaneous. Their aggression evaporated, replaced by a crushing wave of self-realization. They saw the pathetic nature of their choices, the dead-end path of villainy. They stopped fighting, their expressions turning to ones of despair and shame, and simply floated in the water, defeated by their own consciences. On the boat, Tsuyu watched, her large, observant eyes wide with shock. Kero? What was that? Mineta was trembling, pointing a shaky finger. It's him. The ghost vigilante from the news. The jackal. Izuku gave them a single, slow nod, a silent acknowledgement, before leaping from the boat, using the villains' heads as stepping stones to get to the shore. He melted back into the chaos, leaving 2 stunned students in his wake. He moved like a wraith through the battlefield, a force of metaphysical gravity. In the mountain zone, he found Momo Yayorozu, Kyokujiro, and a short-circuited Denki Kaminari cornered by a villain made of rock. The villain was monologuing, savoring their fear. He didn't even see the jackal approach from behind. Izuku placed a hand on the villain's stony shoulder. Clarity. The rockman froze. His ranting stopped. The confidence drained from him, and his rocky exterior began to crumble, not from a physical attack, but from the collapse of his will. He looked down at his hands, then at the terrified students. What am I doing? He mumbled, before slumping to the ground, no longer a threat. Yayorozu stared, her brilliant mind racing, trying to categorize the ability. There was no physical contact of consequence, no energy signature. It's not an emitter or transformation quirk. It defies classification. Jiro could only whisper, "Dude, that was terrifying." Izuku was already gone, a fleeting shadow heading back towards the plaza. He moved among the low-tier villains like a plague of conscience. A thug with a blade quirk suddenly dropped his weapons, horrified by the phantom wounds he felt on his own arms. A woman who could spit acid was paralyzed by the sudden, burning guilt of her past crimes. One by one, the villains of the League's army were taken off the board, not by force, but by the weight of their own souls. The students of 1A, fighting their own desperate battles, could only watch in stunned confusion as their opponents suddenly and inexplicably gave up, collapsing in tears or screaming in psychic torment. A new, terrifying player was on the field, one who didn't fight by their rules. Finally, Izuku reached the edge of the central plaza. Eraserhead was down, his arm gruesomely twisted, his face ground into the concrete by the monstrous Noma. The man covered in hands, Shigaraki, was gloating. "You heroes are so brittle," Shigaraki rasped, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. "And you, Eraserhead, you were so cool. But you're no match for my Noma." This creature, the Noma. Izuku focused on it, preparing to weigh its heart, to find the sin within and turn it against the beast. He reached out with his senses, extending the authority of the scales towards the hulking monstrosity, and found nothing. The sensation was the most horrifying thing he had ever experienced. It was not like weighing a corrupt heart or an empty one. It was like reaching into the very fabric of reality and finding a hole. A void. A psychic black hole of non-existence where a soul should be. There were no scales, no weights, no light, no darkness. Just an endless, silent, screaming emptiness. Trying to judge it was like trying to grab smoke. The psychic backlash slammed into him, a wave of pure nihilism that made his vision swim and his knees buckle. Blood trickled from his nose, dripping onto the concrete beneath him. This thing wasn't a person. It wasn't even a living creature in the way he understood it. It was a puppet. An empty vessel of flesh and bone, animated by stolen power, with no will, no heart, no soul to weigh. His greatest weapon was useless. The Nomu, perhaps sensing his focused attention, turned its beaked head, its blank, unblinking eyes fixing on his position behind a planter. Shigaraki followed its gaze. "Oh? A new player has joined the game," he said, scratching his neck furiously. "You're the one who's been making my NPCs cry. Noma. Kill him." The creature let out a horrifying, bird-like shriek and charged. For the first time since he'd put on the mask, Izuku felt a spike of pure, unadulterated terror. He was no longer the judge. He was just a quirkless boy in a costume, and a biological killing machine designed to fight all might was bearing down on him. He reacted on pure instinct, years of analysis and months of grueling physical training taking over. He threw himself to the side as the Noma's fist obliterated the concrete planter where he had been hiding. Shrapnel flew through the air. Izuku rolled, coming up in a sprint. He wasn't fast enough, he wasn't strong enough. He couldn't fight it. He could only evade. He dodged and weaved, using the terrain of the plaza, his mind a frantic storm of calculations. The Nomu was fast, powerful, but it was also single-minded. A guided missile. He led it on a chase around the fountain, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming. He could see Aizawa's fading consciousness watching him, his one visible eye wide with disbelief. This vigilante, this ghost, he was quirkless. Aizawa could feel it. He had no quirk factor to erase. And yet he was surviving, however barely, against the monster that had defeated him. Stop running, you stupid cheat character! Shigaraki shrieked in frustration. The Nomu swiped, and its claws raked across Izuku's side. The reinforced fabric of his hoodie tore, and a searing pain shot through his ribs. He cried out, stumbling. This was it. He was going to die. Just as the Nomu raised its fist for the final, killing blow, the main doors to the USJ were blasted open with a thunderous boom. Have no fear! A voice roared, a sound that was both a promise and a threat. For I am here! All Might stood in the doorway, his face not smiling. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Shigaraki's head snapped towards the hero, a sick, joyful grin spreading across his face. Ah, we've been waiting. The final boss has arrived. The Nomu, its attention diverted, forgot about Izuku and turned to face its true target. The momentary distraction was all Izuku needed. He scrambled away, clutching his bleeding side, and found cover behind a shattered piece of wall. The pain was intense, but his mind was clear. The scales were shifting again. He watched, panting, as All Might engaged the Nomu. It was a battle of titans, a flurry of blows that sent shockwaves through the entire building. But All Might was at a disadvantage. He was running out of time in his muscle form, and the Nomu's shock absorption quirk was neutralizing his punches. Izuku's gaze shifted to the true source of the imbalance. Not the mindless puppet, but the puppet master. Tamura Shigaraki. He focused on the man-child villain, ignoring the throbbing pain in his side. He extended his authority, and this time, he found a soul. It was a nightmare, a maelstrom of agony and rage. The scales were shattered, the beam broken, the pans overflowing with a chaotic sludge of contradictory weights. He saw it all in a sickening, psychic flash. He saw a small, black-haired boy, Tenko Shimura, alone in his backyard with his dog, wanting nothing more than to be a hero. He saw the horrifying, uncontrollable manifestation of a decay quirk. He saw the dust of his family, the crumbling walls of his home. He saw the dog, turned to ash by a touch meant to be a loving pat, and woven through it all, a soothing, poisonous voice, the voice of all for one. It's not your fault. It's theirs. This whole society is sick. I can show you where to point that magnificent power. He saw a soul that had been systematically murdered and reanimated as a vessel for pure, nihilistic hate. He was a monster, yes. His sin pan was a bottomless pit of malice and murder, but his virtue pan, it wasn't empty. It held the ghost of a single, massive weight, the broken, decayed heart of a child who had just wanted to be saved. Shigaraki was both the villain and the first victim. How could he judge this? How could he balance scales that were so utterly, fundamentally broken? A simple edict of penance would be meaningless to a man who bathed in pain. Clarity would shatter what was left of his sanity. No. The judgment had to be more precise. More cruel. Izuku stood up from behind his cover. Shigaraki, who was cackling as the Nomu gained the upper hand on All Might, noticed the movement. You're still alive? You're a persistent little NPC, he sneered. Izuku walked towards him, his steps steady despite the fire in his ribs. He raised a hand. Tamura Shigaraki, he said, his voice flat and cold through his mask's modulator. I have weighed your heart. Weighed my? Shigaraki started to laugh, but it died in his throat. Izuku's gaze was like a physical weight. He reached deep into the maelstrom of that broken soul, past the rage and the hate, and found the tiny, flickering ember of the boy that was left, and he poured all the power he could muster into a single, targeted judgment. It was not penance. It was not clarity. It was something new. Something terrible. Remembrance. Shigaraki's body went stiff. The manic energy vanished. His eyes, wide and terrified, unfocused. The world of the USJ faded, replaced by a phantom memory so vivid it was real. He felt the warm sun of his childhood on his skin. He heard the happy bark of his dog, Manchan. He felt the phantom itch on his lip he used to get when he was nervous. He saw his sister, Hannah, smiling at him. He saw his mother reaching for him. He remembered his name, Tenko. No. He whimpered, his hands flying to his head, scratching not at his neck, but at his temples, as if to claw the memory out. No! I am Tamura Shigaraki. He gave me my name. Get out of my head. Get out, he screamed, not with rage, but with the pure, agonized terror of a ghost being forced to remember it was once a living boy. The foundation of his identity, so carefully constructed by his master, was cracking. He was destabilized, confused, horrified. The attack was more intimate and more damaging than any physical blow could ever be. It was at that moment that All Might, inspired by the student's bravery and seeing Shigaraki's sudden distress, found a new reserve of strength. He unleashed a furious barrage, going beyond his limits. Plus ultra! He roared, his final punch, a devastating blow powered by sheer will, sending the Noma flying out of the USJ and into the sky. The battle was won. All Might stood, steaming and depleted, a triumphant silhouette against the shattered glass of the dome. The remaining villains, Kurojairi and a now incoherent Shigaraki, were about to be captured when Kurojairi managed to warp them away. Silence descended upon the ruined plaza, broken only by the groans of the injured and the distant wail of sirens. The students were safe. All Might had won. In the aftermath, as the other teachers arrived and began tending to the students, All Might's gaze swept the battlefield. He saw Aizawa, being carefully lifted onto a stretcher. He saw the exhausted faces of the children he had sworn to protect. And then, he saw him. Across the plaza, standing near the entrance, was the jackal. The vigilante's head was tilted, his masked face unreadable. Their eyes met. For All Might, it was like a jolt of lightning. There was something in the figure's posture, in his slender build, something so achingly, terrifyingly familiar. He remembered a rooftop, a desperate, green-haired boy, and the crushing weight of his own realistic, sensible words. He remembered Tsukachi's reports of a new vigilante whose appearance coincided perfectly with that day. In that fleeting moment he knew. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. The jackal raised a hand, not in a wave, but in a gesture of acknowledgement. A quiet salute from one wielder of immense power to another. Then, he tossed the small pellet to the ground. A thick cloud of smoke erupted, and when it cleared, he was gone. All Might stood alone in the center of his victory, but he felt no triumph. He felt only the icy grip of a profound and terrible guilt. The ghost haunting his city, the terrifying entity who could dismantle a man's soul with a single word, was not some monster born of darkness. It was a monster he had created. The name was spoken in whispers at first, an urban legend confined to the dark web and the hushed conversations of police precincts. But after the USJ incident, the whispers became a roar. The jackal was no longer a ghost story. He was real. And the world did not know what to make of him. On a dozen different news channels, his masked, stylized face was the lead story. Grainy security footage from the USJ entrance, a fleeting glimpse captured before the camera was destroyed, was looped and analyzed by experts. An unknown entity who single-handedly incapacitated dozens of villains through what eyewitnesses describe as a form of psychological quirk, said a stern-faced anchor on HNN. Hero Public Safety Commission officials have designated the jackal a high-threat vigilante, urging citizens to report any sightings and not to engage. On a rival network, a panel of commentators argued furiously. "This is a fundamental breakdown of the heroics law," exclaimed a woman in a sharp business suit. "We have an unaccountable individual with a terrifyingly powerful mind control ability passing judgment as he sees fit. He is a villain, plain and simple." "A villain?" countered a pro-hero with a minor telekinesis quirk, his arms crossed defiantly. "He saved the lives of the UE students. He incapacitated villains without causing a single fatality or any significant property damage. His methods may be unorthodox, but his results speak for themselves. Perhaps the system needs a figure like him to keep it honest." The debate raged across the globe. Online, hashtags trended: Jackal Justice, Vigilante or Villain, the conscience of Muzurifu. Merchandisers, ever the opportunists, were already selling unauthorized t-shirts and crude plastic masks. Some hailed him as a messiah, a necessary corrective to a hero society that had grown complacent and commercialized. They pointed to the villains he'd stopped, the corruption he'd exposed in his earlier escapades. He was the hero the people needed, one who fought not for fame or money, but for pure, unadulterated justice. Others saw him as the greatest threat to their way of life since All for One. They saw an anarchist, a terrorist who used psychic attacks to enforce his own twisted morality. He was a symbol of chaos, a specter who proved that the laws and systems they relied upon were fragile. To the HPSC, he was a walking, breathing existential crisis. He could not be controlled, he could not be licensed, and his power was something they could not comprehend, let alone counter. In his darkened room, surrounded by the glow of monitors displaying this global debate, Izuku Midoriya methodically cleaned and stitched the gash in his side. The Nomu's claws had torn through his hoodie and into the flesh beneath. The pain was a sharp, grounding reminder of his own mortality. He wasn't a god. He was a boy in a mask, wielding a divine burden that was starting to feel impossibly heavy. He listened to the world argue about the jackal, but he felt a profound sense of detachment. They weren't talking about him, not really. They were talking about a symbol, an idea. They couldn't see the quirkless, lonely teenager underneath, the boy who felt the phantom pain of every soul he judged, the boy who was more isolated now than he had ever been in his life. The weight of his new purpose was immense, but the weight of his secrecy was a close second. He finished dressing the wound, his movements precise and practiced. The pain was just another variable to be managed. The debate on the screens was just noise. He had work to do. The scales were still imbalanced. In the pristine, light-filled office of UA's principal, the atmosphere was as heavy and oppressive as a tomb. The panoramic window offered a stunning view of the school grounds, a testament to hope and the future of heroism. But inside the room, the three men present were grappling with a ghost from the past. Principal Nizu, a chimera of indeterminate species, sat behind his large desk, his paws steepled before him, his intelligent black eyes betraying a deep, analytical concern. Detective Naomesetsu Kochi stood by the window, his hat in his hands, his face grim, and slumped in a large armchair, looking smaller and more fragile than the world had ever seen him, was Toshinori Yagi, the skeletal, true form of All Might. Aizawa's testimony is unequivocal, Tsukachi said, his voice low and factual. He used erasure on the jackal during the brief moment he was evading the Noma. There was no effect, he confirms, with absolute certainty, that the vigilante is quirkless. Nizu's whiskers twitched. A quirkless individual, capable of incapacitating dozens of hardened criminals with a non-physical ability that bypasses conventional detection and even erasure, and he was able to survive, albeit briefly, in direct confrontation with a creature designed to kill All Might. This is more than a paradox. It is a fundamental challenge to our understanding of quirks and human potential. Toshinori had been silent for a long time, staring at his own bony hands. The guilt he'd felt in the USJ had festered, growing into a monstrous, soul-eating certainty. He had to speak. He had to confess his part in this. It is my fault, he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. The other two men turned to look at him. Toshinori? Tsukachi asked, his brow furrowed with concern. What are you talking about? You saved those children. I won the battle, Toshinori corrected, his voice gaining a raw, ragged edge. But I may have started the war. The day of the sludge villain incident, before I fought it, I was confronted on a rooftop by a boy. He took a shaky breath, the memory replaying in his mind with perfect, agonizing clarity. He was a fan, a bright, intelligent boy with notebooks full of hero analysis that would put some of my own sidekicks to shame. He was quirkless. And he asked me if he could be a hero too. Nizu's ears perked, his gaze intensifying. He was beginning to see the shape of the puzzle. Toshinori's voice cracked with self-loathing. I was tired. I was at my limit. And I was realistic. I told him no. I told him to give up. I told him to be a police officer, that it was a fine profession. I told him it wasn't bad to dream, but that he had to be realistic. He looked up, his sunken eyes filled with a profound horror. I saw his face. I saw the light in his eyes just go out. It was like watching a star die. I crushed his dream and left him alone on that roof. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his face in his hands. His name was Izuku Midoriya. He had green hair, a freckled face, and the exact same build as the figure Aizawa described, the timing Tsukachi. The very first reports of this jackal started appearing in the weeks following that day. I didn't create a villain in the way All for One does. I think I broke a boy's spirit, and from the shattered pieces, he built a ghost to haunt us all. The room was silent, the weight of the confession hanging in the air. Tsukachi's face was a mask of shock as the pieces clicked into place. The quirkless status, the timing, the almost supernatural knowledge of heroes and villains, it all fit. Mizu, however, did not look shocked. He looked deeply, profoundly sad. Causality, he said softly. A single, well-intentioned, realistic piece of advice from the world's greatest symbol of hope inadvertently creates a new, terrifying symbol of justice. The irony is as exquisite as it is tragic. He looked at Tashinori. You must not blame yourself entirely. You acted on the information you had, on a lifetime of experience in a world defined by quirks. How could you have known? What concerns me is the nature of his power. It is not a quirk. It feels older. More fundamental. As if he's tapped into some primal force of order. He isn't just a vigilante, gentlemen. He is a systemic reset. A rogue variable that threatens to bring the entire, delicately balanced equation of our society crashing down. So what do we do? Tsukachi asked, the question aimed at both the principal and the former hero. The HPSC wants him captured or eliminated. But if this is the boy you say it is, Tashinori, we cannot treat him as a common villain, Tashinori said, his voice firming with a new, desperate resolve. I have to find him. I have to talk to him. I made this mess. I have to be the one to try and fix it. Niza nodded slowly. An admirable, but perhaps dangerous, course of action. Be careful, Tashinori. The boy you met on that rooftop is gone. In his place is the jackal, and the judgment of a ghost can be a terrible thing to face. Izuku's new target was a man named Kansei Himawari. To the world, he was the shield hero, Crusader. He was ranked number 9 in the hero billboard chart Japan, a beloved public figure with a brilliant, defensive quirk called Kinetic Guard, which allowed him to create shimmering golden shields that could absorb and redirect any kinetic force. He was a pillar of the community, the face of a dozen charities, a happily married family man whose image was one of absolute, unshakable integrity. To Izuku, he was a festering soul whose scales were so grotesquely imbalanced they made him physically ill to look at. The investigation had taken weeks of painstaking, obsessive work. It began with a pattern. Izuku noticed that Crusader's most spectacular saves, stopping out-of-control vehicles, thwarting armed robberies, all seemed to happen in specific, high-value commercial districts. There was no tactical reason for this concentration. It was a statistical anomaly. He dug deeper. He spent nights learning to code, to slice through firewalls, to navigate the labyrinthine databases of corporate ownership. He discovered a network of shell companies, all leading back to Himawari, all disguised as security consultation firms. The final piece of the puzzle came from the darknet. On a forum for low-level villains, he found whispers of a lucrative gig. Get paid to cause a little mayhem, get captured by a top 10 hero, and serve a minimal sentence in a low-security facility. The contractor was always anonymous, but the hero was always Crusader. The picture was complete, and it was utterly vile. Crusader was running the most insidious protection racket in the country. His agents would cause incidents near businesses that had refused to sign on for his agency's premium security services. He would then swoop in, save the day to rapturous applause, and the terrified business owners would inevitably sign the exorbitant contract. He was a hero manufacturing his own relevance, a fireman who was also the arsonist. The system didn't just allow this to happen, it celebrated him for it. His approval ratings soared with every staged incident. He was the perfect symbol of the rot Izuku was chosen to purge. Exposing him through the media would be difficult. Himawari was a master of public relations, his lawyers were sharks, and Izuku's evidence was all illegally obtained. A direct judgment was required. The scales had to be balanced personally. Izuku found his opportunity on a Thursday night. Himawari was hosting a lavish gala on the top floor of his agency's skyscraper, the Crusader Tower, a gleaming monument to his fraudulent success. Izuku bypassed the high-tech security not with a quirk, but with meticulous planning. He'd studied the building's blueprints for days, finding a blind spot in the sensor grid along the maintenance shaft. He moved through the tower's ventilation system, a ghost in the machine. He emerged in a darkened storeroom on the penthouse floor, the distant sound of champagne flutes and polite laughter filtering through the walls. He put on his mask. The world sharpened. He walked out of the storeroom and into the opulent hallway, his soft boots making no sound on the plush carpet. He bypassed the gala, heading directly for Himawari's private office. The door was locked with a biometric scanner. A problem for a normal intruder, but Izuku had planned for this. He pulled a small device from his belt and placed it over the scanner. A high-frequency vibration, perfectly tuned, tricked the mechanism into thinking a valid fingerprint was present. The lock clicked open. The office was a monument to ego. One wall was a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the glittering city. Another was covered in awards, plaques, and framed magazine covers featuring Crusader's smiling face. Behind a massive mahogany desk, Kensei Himawari himself was on the phone, his back to the door. Of course, the renewal fee is non-negotiable, he was saying, his voice smooth and confident. Consider it an insurance policy. A city like this, well, it pays to have a top 10 hero looking out for your interests. Izuku closed the door behind him. The soft click made Himawari pause. I'll call you back, he said, hanging up. He turned in his high-backed leather chair, a mildly irritated expression on his face. I told my secretary I wasn't to be disturbed. He stopped. His eyes widened, first in confusion, then in dawning recognition as he took in the dark, slender figure and the unnerving, stylized face of the jackal. The man from the news. The ghost of the USJ. You! Himawari breathed, his professional calm evaporating. He surreptitiously pressed the silent alarm button under his desk. The alarm has been disabled, Izuku said, his voice a low, modulated monotone. The security feed to this office is currently looping the last 10 minutes. No one is coming, Kensei Himawari. The hero's composure cracked completely. Fear, raw and primal, flashed in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a desperate, arrogant bluster. What do you want? Money? You've made a grave mistake coming here. I am Shield Hero, Crusader. You are a common criminal. Am I? The jackal asked, taking a slow step forward. I look at you, and I see a man who has built an empire on manufactured fear. You are a parasite wearing the mask of a savior, a sickness that has infected the very idea of heroism. Himawari scoffed, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. You have no proof. Those are insane, slanderous accusations. Your shell corporation, Aegis Solutions, registered in the Cayman Islands, Izuku stated flatly. Your primary enforcer, a low-life villain named Shuji Tanaka, code-named Wrecker. The back-channel payments made to his sister's bank account after every staged incident. I have all the proof I need. The hero's face went pale. This was no random attack. This was a surgical strike. He was exposed. Who are you? He whispered, his voice trembling. I am the one who weighs the heart. The jackal replied, now standing directly before the desk. He raised a hand, and for the first time, Himawari noticed the boy's slender, almost fragile build beneath the dark clothing. It made the cold certainty in his voice even more terrifying. Izuku focused, and Crusader's soul was laid bare before him. It was a swamp. The virtue side of his scales was a barren wasteland, holding only a few withered leaves of the genuine good he'd done early in his career. The sin side was a mountain of filth. Gleaming, golden ingots of greed sat atop heavy, leaden blocks of extortion. But the worst were the countless, slimy, black stones of deceit, each one representing a lie he had told to the public, to his family, to himself. His soul was a monument to the lie that the ends justify the means. You have convinced yourself that you maintain order, the jackal said, his voice echoing the truth he saw in the man's soul. That the chaos you create is a necessary evil to protect the system. A lie you tell yourself so you can sleep in your expensive bed at night. He enacted the first judgment. Clarity. Himawari gasped as if he'd been punched in the gut. The intricate web of self-serving justifications he had woven over the years was instantly incinerated. He saw himself, for the first time, with no filters. He saw the sniveling, insecure man who was terrified of becoming irrelevant. He saw the greedy extortionist, the liar, the fraud. He saw the fear in the eyes of the shopkeepers he terrorized, the disgust in the faces of his own children, had they known the truth. The image of the noble hero he had so carefully crafted shattered, leaving only the ugly, pathetic reality. He began to weep, his head falling into his hands. No, I was helping. You were helping yourself, the jackal corrected, his voice devoid of pity. And now you will feel the balance. He enacted the second judgment. Penance, Kensei Himawari screamed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated torment. The polished, luxurious office vanished. He was standing in a small convenience store as a villain with a strength quirk smashed his display cases. He felt the owner's heart-stopping terror, the sickening dread of financial ruin. He was in a small bakery, feeling the heat of the fire set by one of his own thugs, the baker's life savings turning to ash. He felt the fear, the desperation, the betrayal, and the suffering of every single one of his victims, all at once, a symphony of pain conducted in the concert hall of his soul. He fell from his chair, writhing on the floor, his mind consumed by a guilt so profound it was a physical agony. Izuku watched him for a moment, the psychic exertion leaving him dizzy, his nose bleeding again beneath the mask. He placed a small, encrypted data chip on the edge of the mahogany desk. It contained every piece of evidence he had gathered. When you have finished, the jackal said to the broken man on the floor, you will call a press conference. You will confess to everything. You will expose the rot you represent. The scales demand it. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving the door open. He melted back into the shadows of the tower, a ghost of judgment leaving a shattered symbol in his wake. The next day, the world watched, stunned, as a pale, trembling Kensei Himawari, the shield hero, crusader, stood at a podium and confessed to years of extortion, conspiracy, and fraud. He resigned from his hero work in disgrace, his agency was dissolved, and he was taken into custody. The news hit the hero world like an earthquake. Public trust, already shaken by the USJ incident, began to crumble. If a top 10 hero could be so corrupt, who else was hiding a dark secret? The HPSC went into full panic mode, their attempts to control the narrative failing completely. The jackal hadn't just taken down a hero. He had taken a sledgehammer to the very foundation of their system. In his agency's private training hall, the air thick with heat and the smell of ozone, Endeavor watched Crusader's confession on a massive wall-mounted screen. His fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. The flames of his beard and mustache burned with a furious, violent intensity. This was the ultimate humiliation. This vigilante, this ghost, was making a mockery of their entire profession. He wasn't just breaking the law, he was rewriting the rules. He was passing judgment from the shadows, dismantling careers with whispers and psychic tricks, undermining the very concept of strength and rank that Endeavor had dedicated his entire life to conquering. This jackal was an agent of chaos. A symbol of weakness. An unacceptable flaw in the system. He turned from the screen, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, and unleashed a torrent of white-hot fire, incinerating a row of training dummies. This phantom! He roared to the empty room, his voice a promise of violence. This coward who hides behind a mask and attacks the mind because he is too weak to attack the body. He is a sickness, and he needs to be purged with fire. He stood amidst the rising heat, a pillar of incandescent fury. Let the HPSC and All Might chase their tails. I will find this jackal. And I will burn the ghost from his shell.